Thanks, Carolyn. Really appreciate it. And thanks again to everybody who's joining us today to talk about the 2017 data around top drivers of customer satisfaction in the IVR and live phone channels. We're also going to talk about this notion of advanced dialogue and how it can shape the experience. So very excited to be joined by a few colleagues of mine who are partners with J.D. Power. Ted Narden, he's the president of Ideal Dialogue, and their chief science officer, Dr. James Keaton. So we will chat about that, and it has particular relevance today, given that every actual call that we receive inside the contact center is more important than ever. They're getting more complex as more of the transactional, simple calls are happening through other channels. So very germane points that we want to bring up today in how we manage our communication over this live phone channel in particular. Also, just wanted to comment, we did have a webcast earlier this year around chat and email and some of the top drivers there. So there's lots of channels, obviously, and we've touched on a few of them previously, but also wanted to share the live phone channel and IVR as it pertains to routing as well. So with that, let's get started. Made some introductions. Want to also give you a quick J.D. Power overview to level set where we get our information. Talk a bit about cross-industry perspective because inside the contact center world, it's really expectations are created outside one's industry. And then we're going to talk about how high achievers perform. So I'm going to share some data, information, insights, some specific KPIs that we hope will help you better manage the customer experience around some key areas of opportunity for most organizations. So we're very hopeful that you'll find some excellent insight that you can apply to your operation immediately. Then I'm going to turn it over to Ted and Dr. Keaton and have them talk about some science and some data, information, and insight around dialogue. And I'll get into why we have partnered with Ideal Dialogue to help our clients get to the next level of customer experience, and then we'll hear from them. We're going to make a couple of special offers to those of you in attendance today, so you want to stay on the line for that. They're kind of novel and interesting, and I think it'll add a lot of value to your organization. Then we'll open it up to QA. So let me start off just with a quick overview of the contact center practice. So J.D. Power is well known for customer research. Within that customer research, we dedicate a sizable portion to that, to understanding the customer experience through the contact center channel. So we do gather all kinds of data on IVR self-service, web self-service, IVR routing, phone, so live phone, email, chat, social media, and we gather data and best practices on the left-hand side, so that kind of makes up our benchmarking. Then we do proprietary research to help folks benchmark themselves against verified top performers. That allows us to uncover gaps and helps organizations improve their performance when they become self-aware of the gaps that the customers are pointing out in their operations. And then there's a whole host of recognition services that we offer for those organizations who are high-performing. So that's just a very high-level overview of what we do. If any of these things are intriguing to you, let us know. We'll send out a thank you note. You'll have an opportunity to have all of these slides, and if you want any information from us on any of these services, we'll be happy to have a dialogue with you. Okay, so let's jump into where a lot of our data comes from. So as mentioned, we carry out a lot of studies across many industries. In the case of contact center and live phone, over 50 separate studies contribute to our benchmark information. That means we've talked to consumers of over 1,000 organizations, from utilities to telecom, healthcare, just pretty much all aspects of our industries that we serve. And when we talk to these consumers, we're understanding their satisfaction across the channels, but we use an index methodology. So through that, it's more than just satisfaction, right? It's understanding the relative importance of the drivers of satisfaction. That's what we're going to share with you today. Additionally, through our certification process and through this process, we're able to isolate the impact of certain operational realities, like the impact of a hold or the impact of a transfer, or if you make a customer repeat information. So all of that information is gathered, and we're able to correlate that with the impact to the scores. And so because of that, we're able to really isolate, hey, what is it that is moving it has the potential to move the customer experience needle the most. And we're going to share with you today some of that data that will hopefully help you and your operation and your customer's experience. And of course, we update this annually because things are changing so quickly. Through our certification program, we've been in over 400 contact centers now, and we have a good understanding of what these top performers do in terms of linkages between essentially their strategy and their operations and everything in between. And so we'll share with you some best practices from those top performers. And again, these best practices are updated on an annualized basis. So I wanted to touch quickly on this cross-industry perspective. The notion here is that customer satisfaction is the nexus between customer expectations and the provider performance, right? So that is where satisfaction lies. If you as a provider are able to exceed the expectations that the customer comes into any interaction across channels, then their satisfaction is going to be high. Now, what's happening in the marketplace, especially now when we're going through this very quick and abrupt period of change where new channels are coming on, social is emerging as a very powerful and impactful channel for customer care. The phone calls are getting longer, they're getting more complex. Stresses are being put on our agents that have never been put on them before, and yet you have, which is creating challenges for everybody. However, there are some top performers across channels and within a channel. I've listed a few of them here that show up in our research that are able to understand their challenges, make the appropriate investments in time, energy, financial resources, etc., and have created a fantastic experience for their clients. I've listed a few of them here. You see, Zappos, well-known, USAA, well-known, Discover Card has improved, and now they're a premier service provider in the credit card space. A company called The Guardian. Guardian is a Fortune 260 firm. They're in our certification program. Had, in essence, the highest customer experience score that we've ever recorded in the certification program just this past year. Delta, with their premium program, also did extraordinarily well. Both those firms actually scored above a 900 on a 0 to 1,000 point scale, so they're doing some phenomenal things. Well, the reality is that the experiences that your clients, everyone on this phone, your clients are having with other firms are naturally influencing their expectation of you. If they have a conversation with some of these companies listed on the right and realize that the phone can be answered quickly, the reps do understand who is on the other line, they have access to information about what happened previously, maybe some other channels that were utilized, and they treated the customer with utmost respect, acted in his or her best interest, got the call to resolution in a pleasant way, were able to diffuse any emotions that were present, and then ended the call with specificity as to next steps and in a positive manner. That then becomes implanted in the consumer's brain, and the next call they make, perhaps to some of you all, you're going to get compared, regardless of channel, to that great experience that they had. So J.D. Power, even though we have these 50 studies, more than 50 studies, we work really closely with over a dozen industries. Inside the contact center world, it is really about understanding what the top performers are doing, because that is what those expectations that folks come into your operation are created by these top performers. So a quick illustration of this, many of us on this call naturally measures customer satisfaction. Again, we use an index model, so it's not just a question, how satisfied were you. We actually have identified the top 5 drivers of satisfaction across these channel interactions that are listed here. Promptness in speaking to a person, knowledge of the rep, courtesy of the rep, concern shown by the rep, timeliness resolving your problem, question, or request, and then we measure OSAT. Now, when you look at these, if you measure that in a vacuum, so either in a trending way, comparing yourself to yourself at a previous time period, or sometimes even comparing yourself within industry, it can give you a false sense of security. So just to illustrate this, when we click through, you can see that those scores actually aren't even to the average of top performers. So when you look at this slide, you take something like courtesy as an example. Client scored an 8.19, but when they compare themselves to verified cross-industry top performers, the lowest score achieved across all those certified companies for this attribute, courtesy, is 8.76, and the average score is 9.12. And then some firm out there actually scored a 9.43. So it's not until you're able to literally compare yourself to an objective standard of excellence where the expectations are being created, does it allow one to really assess his or her or their firm's performance. And so we just encourage you, whether you utilize our services or some other services, to get ingrained in the discipline of looking cross-industry at verified top performers, because that's where your expectations are being created for your customers as well. So with that, let's switch gears. It's good and important that you have that grounding, because a lot of the information we're going to share with you is going to be what top performers do, how they react in the course of creating a service experience for their customers. If you look at the live phone, something very interesting is happening. You can see that this represents essentially inside the interaction. You first interact as a consumer with the IVR, more often than not, and then you get to the rep. Some cases you can get straight to the rep, but even then customers perceive that there's an IVR if there's any kind of hold between when the phone is ringing, then there's hold music, or there's announcement telling folks that a rep will be with them. When we ask consumers about their experience, they still perceive that an IVR exists even when one technically doesn't. So, but the takeaway on this particular slide is that the CSR experience is losing its relative importance compared to IVR. So the IVR experience is shaping and influencing the overall experience now more so than it has in the past. So this is kind of a dramatic change. It doesn't necessarily speak to the fact that the CSR interaction in and of itself is not important, but what it does say is that there is a large gap between the good IVR experiences and the poor ones, and because that gap is now accentuated, with the advent of natural language technology and the ability to navigate very complex menus with fewer commands spoken verbally, and the commitment that many high performers have made to placing an opt-out option at the very front, and we'll talk about what that percentage is here in a little bit, but up at the front of the IVR is making the experience stark between those who are incorporating the latest technology that's finely tuned, right? I'll get into IVR here in a second about some of the gaps that we see, but the potential of natural language is fantastic, but there are some roadblocks and problems and unique challenges with it. But if you have a good, clear way to get to the rep and you give folks an opportunity to opt out, many organizations have made that commitment, and if you haven't, that's when this score comes down and has a very significant impact on the overall SAT, and now you're putting your reps in a very difficult position from the get-go. So this is a trend that we are looking closely at, and there's some good reasons for it. So if we look and we start connecting the dots here, you can see that there's three main drivers inside the IVR. Now, this is IVR routing. We do have data on IVR self-service, but that's beyond the scope of this particular webcast. But what you can see here is clarity for some time has been the number one driver, and all clarity is that the customer knows what to do next, right? So it's more like a feeling that a customer has. So it's almost like if you, this is a measure of relative stress. If a menu is unclear or the experience is unclear or the offering inside the IVR to do any number of things is not clear and the customer doesn't feel comfortable about knowing what to do, knowing his or her options, et cetera, that clarity score gets very important and ends up being very low. Right? So if, on the other hand, if you've created a menu, and you can do this through DTMF with touch tones or with a good, clear natural language engine, and you can early on in that interaction with that IVR start to reduce stress by making people feel comfortable that, I have a way out or I know what to do next, then their clarity scores are going to be very high. And it's now getting even more important than it has been previously. And again, this is a reflection that in some organizations there is a high degree of clarity, right? And it is becoming very noticeable when there is a low degree of clarity about that phone interaction. So that's just something important to note. Now, when you feed that clarity, so under clarity, there's all kinds of what we call diagnostics. So here is an example of a diagnostic that we ask, and this is from real client data. And this is your first KPI from top performers that you want to take note of. So it's circled here in green. The question is did you have to provide the same information more than once using the automated phone system? So we're not to the point where that question is answered to 0% for anybody, right? Even the best organizations on the whole report that 27% of their consumers say that I had to repeat or submit the same information more than once. So that is the first thing that you want to look at. If you don't measure this, you should start measuring it. In this particular case, if you see in the upper left-hand corner of the slide, when we did our analysis, we do relative impact. The relative impact score here is minus 8.54. And for the IVR interaction, it was the #1 dissatisfier, right? So when we do our analysis, we're able to isolate the specific actions or inactions or presence or non-presence of certain features that will drive up or down performance. And in this case, this client needed to do a root cause on what is going on, right? Why is it that folks are repeating information more than once? Now, in this case, they had a natural language engine, right, that was behind and driving the IVR experience. So that is the first place that we recommended that these folks should look around the tuning, the ability to filter out background noise, any jargon that or colloquialisms that are not being picked up, et cetera, that are keeping folks from getting to where they think that they want to go. And you can imagine how that would be, could create problems with clarity, right, or this notion of, I feel good about what's happening if I speak something that I believe is clear and I get back from the system, I didn't quite catch that. Could you say that again? That creates a lot of angst because I'm using my words and those words aren't clear. So that can create a barrier to good communication right from the get-go. This also could be an issue around rep authentication. We don't have enough time to talk about that, but that is, even though this question asks folks to look specifically at the auto phone system, if you are asking consumers to repeat the same information that you gave it within the system at the rep level, then it could also manifest itself in this particular interaction. If you look at a couple more things, or one more thing, this is another thing for you all to think through, that 78%, so when we do these studies, right, we ask a ton of questions, and in this case, we're trying to ascertain a consumer's ability to reach a representative directly. Can they opt out and get to a representative? And in this case, the client reported that 46% of the time they could not get to a rep, whereas if you look at our verified top performers, that's 22%. So 78% of consumers are answering that top performers provided a way to get directly to representatives. So that's one of the reasons why this IVR is going up in importance, is that some firms are committed to making it easy on the consumer, and they're differentiating themselves, and some are choosing not to make it as easy for multiple reasons, some of them better than others, and their goal is to create higher containment. But just understand that oftentimes higher containment does not drive high degrees of customer satisfaction, and there's a price in essence to be paid for making it a difficult thing to get to a rep. So this will speak to organizations with higher effort. If you want to be a low effort, easy to do business organization, consider moving that opt-out up higher into your menu. Now, when we talk about the drivers of the CSR performance, it's growing in importance of the timeliness. It's the #1 driver actually across most every channel. And of course, now more than ever, we're very busy, and timeliness is gaining in importance. Now, here's a couple more stats I want to share with you before I turn it over to Ted. Providing information more than once, we saw that in the IVR. In this case, with this particular client, we see that this is the #1 driver for them, and this varies from client to client, but in essence, their customers are saying, hey, 41% of the time, you're asking me to give information that I already gave at some point, whether that's in the conversation itself due to an extended hold where repeat information happened, whether that's authentication from the IVR out to the rep and we're authenticating the same information, transfers, et cetera. So this is a significant problem, but no, even the best performers are still coming in at 13%. So that's something, if you don't measure today, it creates a very significant drop in customer satisfaction. You can see that on the right-hand side. With this particular client, 235-point index drop when folks perceive that they had to repeat information. So if that's happening on 41% of your calls, it starts to make sense why this would be their number one issue. And it really does speak to the timeliness issue, right, which is the number one driver. And it speaks to courtesy, concern, speaks to knowledge. So all these attributes that we talked about earlier on the previous page is affected by having to provide information more than once. And so this is something that you all, as business leaders, should look very closely at. With this deck, you'll see some of these with some suggestions on the left-hand side. So these are essentially for organizations that have a performance profile like this. We often see that authentication policy is an issue. There can be a group of reps with very high incident rates. The screens, the multitude of screens switch happens at key data entry moments, which creates the need to ask for information more than once. But when you have a situation like this where it's happening 41% of the time, this is something that really needs to be institutionalized and corrected at the training, QA, and coaching level. So that's what you see on the left-hand side. Okay, moving along to another stat. So this is from, again, top performers placed on hold. With this particular client, it was the number 5 reason. We oftentimes see placing folks on hold being more impactful, and so it might be the second or third, in some cases the first driver of dissatisfaction. But on this, you want to look at the green circle. Green circle gives us what the top performers do. So if you don't measure it, and you have to measure it by voice of the customer, right? If you measure this 35% is what top performers average. If you measure this via your system, it'll always be lower than what customers perceive, right? So if you just pull reports and look at it and go, hey, I'm at 15% hold rate because your ACD and your switch picked up the fact that the system itself was on hold, that is not accurately capturing all the mutes that are going on and also just the dead air where the customer is perceived that there's nothing happening. So the most accurate way to really understand what's happening inside your world is to go through a customer perception of their experience. And if you shoot for a 35% hold rate, you'll be in very good shape. Okay, FCR, I want to quickly touch on this. There's a million ways to measure it. When we measure it, we ask 2 questions. 1, is the issue resolved? And 2, how often, please enter the number of times you contacted the client about this particular question, problem, or change issue. The product of those 2 questions equals for top performers, 73% roughly, is the first contact resolution. With this client, it was at 46%. Obviously, a very large difference, almost 100 points when the resolution goes from 1 to 2 times contacted. So very important. Again, lots of ways to measure it. We believe that having a delay to your research, so in other words, don't ask this question in an immediate post-call survey. Your answer will be skewed way up there. Give it at least 2 days, maybe 5 days. If you want to get really fancy, you could ask it in a relationship survey at the 30-day mark about a specific interaction, and that will also help you get a more accurate read on first contact resolution. But even the best of the best out there, 73% is a great goal for you to achieve using this formula. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn this over to Ted and Dr. Keaton, but I want to just say a few words about Ideal Dialogue. So J.D. Power is in a very fortunate position. We work with a lot of great clients. Those clients are oftentimes high performers, and we work with our share of folks who want to get better. And one of our responsibilities that we take seriously is sourcing solutions that can make a real difference in the customer experience, and then working with certain solution providers and joining forces, if you will, to create solutions that will advance the cause of our clients. And one of the areas that we saw a large gap in with even top performance is the fact that there is low-hanging fruit. There's customer experience capital, if you will, sitting out there around dialogue and around the emotional connection between your reps and the customer and the resulting impact on the perception of the brand and even shopping, buying, retention behaviors. So I wanted to give Ted and Dr. Keaton an opportunity as partners of ours who we collaborate with to move the customer experience up. I wanted to give them an opportunity to share some information and insight with you, and then also share with you a special offer that they have. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Ted Narden, the president of Ideal Dialogue, and he'll facilitate the conversation with Dr. Keaton. Ted?
Hey, thank you, Mark. That was a great introduction. I appreciate that. We are certainly proud partners of J.D. Power and love working with you and your team. And at this point, I think it builds perfectly off of what you were talking about in terms of complexity, or how difficult it is sometimes to achieve things that seemingly are so easy, such as the perception of hold and first call resolve, and reducing effort in the call, which is what we ascribe to such things as asking for a name multiple times or maybe information given multiple times. All of that, we, over the last decade, have been, actually almost 15 years now, have been studying in depth to understand how to maximize, optimize a conversation between two people. And it seems easy. A conversation is something we are used to doing as human beings. We do it all the time. We've been doing it for a very long time as human beings, and yet we've realized that it's not as easy as it looks. So Dr. Jim Keaton is on the phone here with us, and Jim, if you wouldn't mind, give us a little bit of an idea of the complexity of a conversation. I think it would help form the foundation of a few insights we can provide in this area.
You bet, Ted. Hello to everyone. As you probably see in the slide in front of you, we tried to estimate the number of combinations, possible combinations for a conversation prior to even an agent saying hello. And the graphic you see is honestly a conservative estimate of the possible combinations, because when we think about it, for those of you familiar with the Big Five personality type indicator, we could say that there are 32 different types of customers, 32 different types of analysts, just as a basic way of getting at the complexity, whether that's neuroticism or extroversion or openness or whatever else. Then you look at the whole notion of the specialist and what the specialist is encountering in terms of their emotional state, whether they're bringing frustration from a prior call, or maybe it's the first call of the day or whatever else. We also know, just because of the different channels now, whether it's a social media type or a voice or email or chat or whatever, that that's going to add more complexity to it. Add on all those customer issues, add on all the specific types of issues, like whether it's a retention call that you're handling, or sales call, or general inquiry or billing or whatever else. You ask yourself conservatively, how many possible combinations are there before that first word of hello? And conservatively, we're saying about 750 million. So the point that we're trying to make here is that even though we all communicate on a daily basis, and it seems somewhat effortless, when we take a step back, what we realize is our industry potentially is dealing with the most complex phenomenon we know, and that's human interaction. So that's both the challenge as well as the potential for what can happen, especially with emotional connection.
And Jim, you often refer to that as it's often looked at as more difficult than rocket science some days. And I think that if you look at the next slide, looking at this complexity, we had to say, how do we attack this? How do we take a look at this from a different direction? If having a conversation is really that difficult, what can we do about it? So we looked at hundreds of thousands of surveys and said, what's going on in these surveys that we can glean from that and pull out what somebody can do in a conversation that helps. And what we found was a few things that are very interesting. First of all, if you combine what we found there with the research on human communication, we really began to find that what we thought was something unsolvable, it turns out it is fairly solvable. But on the next slide, what you'll see, what our main finding was that, in fact, a lot of satisfaction is based on winning what is called a no-win situation. Amongst many things, that you can do in a conversation to have it progress and optimize, you would say, the outcome of that conversation. Winning the no-win situation is probably the paramount, the one that's probably the biggest facing us today. And again, Jim, why don't you tell us a little bit about what we found and what we continue to research around this no-win situation?
As you can see in the middle there, we're suggesting we're pretty much at a perfect storm. The complexity of our products are going up. We know everything now is becoming smart, whether it's the cat dish now or whether it's our vacuum or whatever else. The complexity and interconnectedness of our products has gone way up, which is making solving problems much more of an issue. Also, when we look at importance, one of my favorite new terms is called nomophobia, and that's the fear of not having your mobile device, nomophobia, that some people are now experiencing. As a matter of fact, at the University of Connecticut, there is a therapy center for people that actually have dependence on their mobile devices. And we're seeing now, I don't know, I have the same thing, Ted, I think you do too. When I leave the house and realize I don't have something to connect me, like my smartphone, it starts to panic a little bit. So we're starting to find out that the things that we carry around with us are much more important than they ever have been. Add one more thing, and that is because of the internet, we really have access to an incredible amount of information, low-hanging fruit, if you will. So now we can go on and take a look at a chat or type in a question into Google, or we can talk to other people or go to a website of a client, and often we can solve the easy problems, and we can solve them relatively quickly. So what we're starting to find is people that choose to make contact, 78% of them have already tried something, so when they get on the phone, not only is the communication complex, but the task is also complex. It's very, very important to them, and they've already tried a lot of things, which really asks the question, well, what happens if you call up and there really isn't an immediate solution? The actual resolution cannot be offered at that moment in time. What's the value proposition of an agent? Is it just to apologize and get off the phone? Or maybe there's something else that can be offered that actually adds value and improves the customer experience and therefore brand loyalty.
Well, what we have found is if you look at any given operation, you very often find two agents sometimes sitting right next to each other who are both handling the same no-win situation, and yet one is getting top-notch customer satisfaction scores and one is not. You can look across their whole enterprise and see where there are people achieving, all things remaining equal, the call, driver, et cetera, that they are achieving higher results than other people sitting in the same place. And so what that led us to do is ask the question, what is it that's happening? And you'll see on the next slide that we discovered people are in fact achieving higher results by having what we call dialogue with other individuals. And we can classify a dialogue, or let's put it this way, you know dialogue when you hear it because it really has three solid things that you will see occurring during that conversation. One is that the conversation will be professional. It has to be professional or it can't achieve dialogue. The second is that it will have an air of personalization. In other words, you will listen to that conversation and you will say, you know, it sounds like that conversation could not have happened with another person exactly like this, even though it may have been the same topic. So you get the feel of personalization. And the third part of that is that at some point in that conversation, there will be a spark or a moment of spontaneity. And so that's the ultimate conversation. And, Jim, why don't you tell us a little bit, though, about other types of conversations that you might have leading up to dialogue. And you can see here where there are different levels of achievement with those, which we can walk through. But just give us a flavor of transaction and interaction as well.
You bet. So these are designs of conversation trying to answer the question, what is the role of the agent with the customer? And the answer, according to a transactional perspective, is mostly the agent is there to exchange information. They're there to get an account. In some senses, you can even refer to them as a human IVR, where the agent's job is to be quick, to be efficient, and be correct, and to get off the phone fairly quickly. So the human factor, those kinds of communication issues that really transcend the task, are not addressed. And so people are really taught to think of customers as accounts or problems to be solved. One other perspective that we encounter a lot, and it seems almost now to be the norm of the industry, is an interaction perspective, which is to say, let's add something of a social element in there. So let's try to treat people a little bit better, and let's almost take a theatrical perspective. So what that means is learn how to apologize in a way that sounds sincere, or use words that connote empathy, but you're not actually empathetic. You're teaching your agents how to sound empathetic, but for the most part, they're still fairly guided, sometimes even scripted in what they need to say in the process that they go through. So it sounds a little bit more genuine at times, but then again, the notion is I've apologized 100 times today, and so it sounds like this is the 101st time I've apologized. So transaction is an economic model. Interaction is much more a theatrical model. Dialogue, as Ted had mentioned, is the notion of a communication model where two individuals can have a unique conversation that only the two of them could have based on that situation and the exigencies of the moment. And that's where we find, as you can see from the numbers in front of you, that's where we see an incredible ROI when it comes to what is the value of an agent, even in the no-win situation.
And so from that, we have taken a look at it from multiple directions in our research and have been able to develop a diagnostic instrument which we use to determine at what level individuals are communicating and then be able to bridge the gap. In addition to that, certainly we know that there are some specific, what we call habits. They're really skills that are used without even thinking that get people to a dialogue level versus being at transaction or interaction. We've been able to isolate those and build a program around that to help people get to those essential habits over a course of time. On the next slide, you'll see some samples from folks that we have worked with directly and what they have seen by moving to the dialogue level. We talk about doing it one conversation at a time. That is really a key differentiator in the program that we use, and that is that you're not looking at this necessarily on the whole. We want to improve on the whole, but we have to begin to move people's conversations one at a time. So it's not just a...
Hey, James, could you dump the internet, please?
Hey, Jim. I'm sorry, but there's actually higher average retention rates. There are increases in sales conversations and escalations. It hits really every different aspect of operation, but only when they do, in fact, apply this authentic, genuine approach. And that's really where the difference is. It's not providing a script to say, here's a better script to use than the one you've had, but here's how to develop an authentic engagement with another individual, and it can have profound effect on operations. On the next slide, we talk about some special offers, and for us, we would love to offer what we call a communication optimization survey, and it's the ability to take a quiz about your organization's proficiency for communication to see where you are. We'll give you some insight beyond that based on your scores and help you determine a little bit there where you may have some gaps and what types of things could fill those gaps for you, and we'd be happy to do that as part of having been part of this webinar. So, Mark, appreciate the time, and we'll turn it back over to you and see if you have any questions.
Great, Ted. Thank you so much, you and Dr. Keaton. Fascinating to be sure, but, you know, looking back at this, So on the webcast, really focusing in on this dialogue, this is exactly what I'm talking about, the low-hanging fruit that is out there for most organizations that does require some investment, obviously, but it's investment that can have profound impact to the customer experience and to the bottom line. And the fact is, it is complex, but it's doable. So we're excited about our partnership with Ideal Dialogue, and also really encourage all of you on this phone call. When you get the thank you note, you'll have an opportunity to download the information. You also have an opportunity to click a link, go over, fill in the surveys, 10 questions, yes or no, won't take a lot of your time, and then we'll get back to you based on the research. Another thing that we want to offer those of you on the call today is an opportunity to kind of take a look at some influential best practices. So what you're seeing here are 3 practices that we have in what we call our best practices scorecard, and it's part of our benchmarking toolkit offering. If you remember at the beginning, I introduced the products and services that we offer. This is an element of our benchmarking service. It's also an element of our assessment when we come on site, do the assessment, and it's an element of our certification. In fact, you can see on this particular example where we have over a dozen categories. One of those categories is coaching. Within the coaching category, there are several practices, but this one that is in green around coaching includes agents listening to their own calls as part of the defined coaching practice at least monthly, is one of our criteria that you need to have present for certification. Right, so I wanted to give folks a kind of an idea. When we talk about best practices scorecard, we have 169 of these practices. These are examples of the practices that are in there. Now that 169 excludes the best practices we have around BPO and around work at home. We have separate sections there that only apply, obviously, if you're utilizing a BPO or a work-at-home model. But what we'd like to do is send those of you who are interested essentially a best practices scorecard showing a few of these, like around 20 of these best practices. And you'll have an opportunity to look at the best practices, see what it is that we're measuring top performers against, do a self-assessment and turn that around and send that back to us. And then what we'll do is we'll look at it and we'll let you know how you score relative to verified top performers. Not every top performer gets 100% of these. In fact, when we look at this in what we call a comprehensive evaluation, we still have had no organization get every single practice to date. So we have many that get most of them, but no one has gotten all of them. But these are found in top performers, and we'd just love to give you some feedback and let you know, one, expose you to what these top performers are doing in the form of these practices, and then two, give you some feedback that will hopefully help you understand kind of, at least against these criteria, where it is that you stand. So those are a couple things that we wanted to make sure you were aware of. Let me just jump into a little bit of detail here in terms of sharing some of these practices with you. So on the coaching, we have found that the one-on-one coaching sessions are scheduled and actually occur at least weekly, right? And so let's imagine that you all got hold of these practices, and as an executive team or a management team, you look at this and you confidently say, yes, this happens. We know that each one of our reps get formal one-on-one coaching at least weekly. Now, if we were to go in and ascertain that, we would look at your processes. So we'd look at any policies you have in place that you give to your supervisors. We'd look at your process flow charts that says what is supposed to happen, how often. We'd look at the calendars, et cetera, et cetera. We'd also ask the supervisors, those actually doing the one-on-one coaching, we'd ask the end reps about the experience. And what we have found is that there is oftentimes a large disconnect between practices that you think are going on or you're assuming going on, especially if you get to the site director level and above, because you know it's a process and a policy and that it exists. But if you go and talk to the frontline reps, you'll find oftentimes that some of these folks who live in this environment where they're supposed to get coached weekly, they will tell you, I haven't been coached in 3 weeks, or I haven't been coached in 4 weeks. It's very eye-opening. And in that case, when we start, if we get a one-off, just some weird situation that is easily explained, we can still give an organization credit for having this practice when we come on site. But oftentimes, we will go and interview those folks, and if we see a pattern of this happening, you would not get credit, even though the vast majority do get coached on a weekly basis. We would say that top-performing organizations make sure that that happens religiously, right? So it's very important that you not only look at the processes, but you really get down all the way through the front line when we give you these practices and ask those folks to be honest. Now, one of the challenges you'll have doing this internally is that you can oftentimes get a higher than average score because folks are afraid to talk about their supervisor, right? And say, no, I haven't had a coaching session in 3 weeks, right? Or I've only had 5 this year, and they're supposed to have 10. So that is the value of having a third party do that. So you could have us do it for you, and we'd be happy to chat with you. If you have somebody who you know and trust is not part of your organization, get them these criteria and have them ask, because you will invariably get a higher perception of your own performance if you do it than if someone else does it. On this other coaching, best practice, listening to their own calls. So we have just found that very few things can replace the learning that happens when people hear themselves and their voices. So if that's not a practice, we mandate it, if you will. It's one of the criteria that you have to have. But we're looking for that practice that it happens during these feedback sessions. And the last one is coaching involves self-discovery. So there's many, many different ways for folks to conduct a coaching session, and we try not to be in these practices too prescriptive. In some cases, we have to be prescriptive, otherwise the practice will lose its punch. This is one of those cases where the best performers as an organization are asking their reps, so the coach, as part of their coaching model, are asking the reps to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the call that they've just listened to. So if you take one of these in isolation, it's powerful, but if you put them all together, all of these practices together, and you consistently do them, that's where you start to see a very large difference in top performers versus those folks who don't score as high as their potential would allow. So this is just a sample. These 3 will be included in what we send out to you, but there's many more categories, and we hope you take advantage of that offer. So with that, I'm going to look at my trusty chat questionnaire here and see if there's anybody who have a question. So here's a question around placed on hold. Okay, so this refers to the research that I pointed out earlier on during our discussion. And placed on hold, the question is, include queuing, waiting to speak to an agent, or only when an agent puts them on hold? So we do ask both questions. What I was referring to, though, in the research had to do with only the rep putting the agent, or I'm sorry, putting the consumer or customer on hold. So that data that you get relates to a whole series of questions where we preface the question set with thinking only about your interaction with your call center rep, right, or your chat representative if we do this work for you with a chat or email or whatever. So it's focused, the data that I provided was focused on the interaction with the rep. I have another question here, so thank you for that question. If you have any more, add them into the chat capability that Caroline referenced at the beginning of the call. Here's another question, and this is for you, Ted or Dr. Keaton. Is it more difficult to carry on a conversation now than it was 10 years ago? And if so, why is that?
That's a really good question. I think that I'll let Dr. Keaton answer from his perspective, since that's his area, but I will tell you from the customer support avenue, we talked a little bit about the no-win situation and being on the rise. I think there's one other thing that contributes to difficult conversations, and that is the emotions involved. There was a time when, for example, you could work with billing calls, billing-related calls, and have no emotion involved because maybe somebody's trying to question whether or not a fee should apply or not apply. They just had a question about it. And now we're hearing some people who are very upset about perhaps a 50-cent charge they're not aware of where it came from, or 25 cents. So the emotional charge, I think, makes it a lot more difficult to connect with people. But I think there are also other things, maybe even generationally, and Jim's area of study is in this. Jim, did you want to offer something on that? Oh, we may have lost Jim on the call. Apologize for that. But I will fill in for a couple of parts around generational. I mean, one of the things we often get asked, actually, is whether or not there is a difference in today's millennials in how they communicate. And there certainly is a noticeable, at least with some of them, a desire to communicate more through computer-mediated machines, if you will. So we got the phones, we have limited characters, we have the social media, texting and such. All of those things combined seem to limit some of the conversational ability. And as Jim talks about and has written about, we're losing the front porch a bit. We just don't spend time talking to each other. So what we have found when we roll these programs out into different communities, different groups of people, we have found that many of them will take to it, but many of them will say these are things that not even their parents have taught them, or perhaps they're not learning in school anymore. So I do think it is a bit more difficult to find that in people, but a lot of people still enjoy communicating and still enjoy learning those skills. So we've had good luck in training people.
Fantastic. Well, I appreciate that. We'll answer any other questions privately, but definitely want to be respectful of your time. So it's straight up 3 o'clock on the East Coast, and we really appreciate those of you who joined us today. And if we can be of any assistance to you at all, please just respond to the email that you'll get thanking you for your attendance, and let us know how we can help. But we thank you, and we look forward to spending some more time together with you all later. Bye-bye.